The idea that Muslims actually care about their fellow Muslims is insane. They don't. What they care about is Jews. There is something at the very root of Islam and followers of the Muslim religion who cannot bear any war in which Israel is fighting, and most of all loathes any war in which Israel is winning. And you can see it. It's at the absolute core of their being. This is why they are on the streets of this city and others marching. It's not because they love fellow Muslims, it's because they hate Jews.
So you're saying there's something at the root of the religion. Well, let's tease that apart. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's two particular things worth mentioning. One is, of course, that Muhammad, the founder of Islam, himself beheaded, massacred many, many Jews. Famously, there's one battle in particular, and the Banu Quraysh. It's a story you can find in the Quran and the Hadith, and of course this is because the Jews would not accept the revelation of Muhammad, such as it was, and so they were seen within Islamic tradition as being one of the first people who turned down the opportunity to join Islam, and as a result, of course, Muhammad decapitated hundreds and hundreds of Jews. So that's not a good start. But there's a bigger thing, I think, within the Muslim world which is worth mentioning, which the late Bernard Lewis pointed out on a number of occasions, which is the great problem within Islam when it comes to not just Judaism but the wider non-Islamic world is that the Muslim religion claims to be the last revelation from God to man, which, as we all know, is a very large claim to make. It says, there have been previous revelations, but this is the last and final one. And what's more, God has given you a book, the Quran. And the Quran is the one book you need. The opening, here is the book wherein is no doubt, which is quite a bold claim as well, I'd say. But the claim at the foundation of Islam is, here is the book wherein is no doubt, and it's the only book you need. And it's the final word from God that man will ever have. Now, if you are the recipients of this book, the people who end up either converting or being forced to convert to Islam, and eventually the areas that Islam takes over by force, if you are somebody who's brought up in that tradition, you would think that being the recipient of the final revelation from God, you would be in a just tip-top situation. You know, you would imagine that, well, this is going very well. We've got the final revelation from God. What's not to like? What's not on our side? And then several things happen in the millennia since, which is, first of all, many, many Muslims realize that despite having the final revelation from God, things don't seem to be going very well. Until oil is discovered in certain parts of the Middle East, most people live in total destitution. The discoveries and enlightenments of Europe largely passed the Muslim world by. This shouldn't be exaggerated. Certain parts of the Muslim world, of course, give the Western world certain parts of what becomes the Western European tradition. So there were times of interplay. There were times of mutual learning. And now, of course, everyone looks back at them, or many people look back at those times with nostalgia. Nevertheless, in the main, the Muslim world cut itself off from the rest of the world and didn't care to learn from the rest of the world, didn't improve the economic conditions of its people, totally failed to create societies anything like as successful as, for instance, European societies. And therein a question arises, which is, if we are the recipients of the final revelation, why is everything so awful where we live? And then you have the additional thing, which is, and how come the Jews return or re-establish of course, many Jews are already living in the area that's now Israel, but already lived there, but many others come from other parts of the world, including from the Middle Eastern countries where they're chucked out by the governments in 48 and so on. The Muslim world sees this tiny, tiny bit of land, which, among other things, is the only bit of the Middle East that doesn't have any oil. And they make of it a much more successful country than any of the countries around. Now, if you create a Palestinian state, you just have another failed Arab state, another failed Muslim state to add to the more than 50 already failed Muslim and Arab states. What is the explanation that the Jews who refused the Prophet's invitation to Islam are still here, have this tiny bit of land, and make all of these discoveries and other things that show themselves to be so successful. It's some kind of stab in the heart. And instead of saying, we're doing this wrong, the thing is, the Jews are doing something right, and that must mean that they've rigged the game. That's why they care, among other things. And it leads to the deep pathology of anti-Semitism, which has been largely eradicated in Europe among Europeans, not entirely, but largely. There are still some bits of the far right you can find across Europe, and occasionally in the UK with a sort of the whiff of this noxious thing still emerges. On the left, of course, it's much closer to the boat. But principally anti-Semitism in our own day, of the kind that we hoped had ended with Hitler, exists and indeed thrives in the Muslim world. And the Muslim world is now in our world in Europe, and so we have the Hitlerian horrors of anti-Semitism back.